Hey, deep divers. Ready to dive into something kind of weird?
Hit me with it.
So have you ever thought you could, see corruption?
Not really. I mean, unless you're talking about someone walking around with a suitcase full of cash.
Nope, not quite like that.
Oof.
Think more about appearances.
Appearances. Okay, now I'm really curious.
You sent in some articles about this study, right? The one linking politicians' weight to how corrupt their country seems.
Oh, right, yeah. That one. Politicians' weight and corruption. Is that even a real thing?
That's what we're going to find out. But first, you got to understand, measuring corruption directly is almost impossible.
Yeah, I mean, there's no corruption-o-meter, right?
Exactly, so researchers got to get sneaky. They use these indirect clues called proxies to hint at corruption.
Proxies, like stand-ins for the real thing.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like this. You see cookie crumbs leading to your kid's room. You kind of know they raided the jar, right? Even if you didn't catch them.
Uh-huh. Sneaky little cookie crumb trails. So they're using politicians' weight as, a cookie crumb for corruption.
You got it. This researcher, Pavel Blavatsky, looked at 15 of those countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, analyzed photos of almost 300 cabinet ministers.
From photos, just looking at pictures.
Yep, photos from 2017. And get this, they use machine learning, super high-tech stuff, to figure out the minister's BMI, body mass index, just from the pictures.
Wow, seriously, just from pictures. So how did they connect that to actual corruption?
Okay, so they took that BMI data and compared it to these things called corruption indices. They're like report cards for countries on how corrupt people think they are. You ever heard of Transparency International?
Oh, yeah, they give those corruption scores, right?
Right. And guess what they found?
What? Tell me.
Countries with heavier politicians tended to score worse on those corruption report cards.
Whoa, hold on. So basically, if a country's cabinet is full of, let's say, robust ministers.
More likely to be seen as corrupt. Yeah, that's kind of what the study's saying.
That's wild. So picture this. On one side, you've got your super fit Estonian ministers, all lean and clean, just like their country's reputation.
And on the other,
You've got, well, the ministers from places like Turkmenistan, maybe enjoying a few too many state dinners, and their countries are seen as more corrupt.
you're getting it. But, and this is important, just because two things are linked doesn't mean one causes the other.
Right, right. Classic correlation versus causation. Just because I eat ice cream when it's hot doesn't mean ice cream causes heat waves.
Exactly. So the big question is, why might this link between weight and corruption exist? Is it culture? Power dynamics? This study throws a whole bunch of questions up in the air.
It's like a puzzle, right? Why would heavier politicians be in countries seen as more corrupt?
Right. And there's more. They also looked at what happened in our media. They had this big velvet revolution back in 2018, got a whole new cabinet, slimmer folks in charge.
Oh, yeah. A whole new slimmed-down government. Did that, instantly fix the corruption problem?
Well, not really. Their corruption score didn't change much right away.
Huh. So what's the deal there? Did the revolution not really change anything?
It shows that people's perceptions of a country, especially about something as complex as corruption, are hard to change. Even if things are getting better, people still hold on to the old image.
Yeah, I get it. Reputations are hard to shake. Okay, but what about the average body type in a country? You'd think countries with generally heavier people would also have heavier politicians, right?
Seems logical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But get this, it's often the opposite.
Well, seriously, so you're telling me a country full of, marathon runners could have a cabinet full of?
Ministers who prefer a different kind of marathon, the dessert buffet marathon,
Hmm.
maybe. They saw it, especially in those Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, thinner ministers, but on average the people there are a bit heavier.
Whoa, that's crazy. It's like the political world has its own rules for body types. And speaking of weird things, one of the articles mentioned a kind of silver lining to all this.
Okay, silver lining to corruption. Now that's something I gotta hear.
Right. Sounds kind of strange.
So remember how some countries have heavier politicians and thinner populations?
Yeah, like those Baltic states with the slim ministers, but everyone else loves their pastries.
Exactly. Now this is just one theory, but one idea is that the corruption itself might be, in a really messed up way, kind of healthy for the general population.
Hold on, did you just say corruption could be healthy? That's a new one.
I know, it sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But the idea is that the corruption sucks up all the resources at the top, so there's less left for everyone else.
So because of the corruption, people have less to eat and end up being thinner. That's dark.
Yeah, it's pretty
Okay.
bleak, but it just shows how wild and complicated the relationship between politics, power, And, well, everybody's weight can be.
Definitely complicated. And just to be clear, we need way more research to really understand what's going on. This is just one study, and there's a lot more to explore.
But it definitely gets you thinking, right? So get ready to dive even deeper when we come back. We're going to tackle the big question. What does this all mean for how we see power, health, and corruption around the world? Don't go anywhere.
All right, deep divers, before we got sucked into that whole corruption and weight thing, we were talking about this study, remember? The one linking how heavy politicians are to how corrupt their countries seem, especially in those former Soviet countries.
Yeah, it's definitely been a lot to think about. But now got to figure out where we go from here. What did we actually learn? And does it mean anything bigger?
That's the real question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think we have all the answers yet. But this study is a perfect example of how researchers are finding new ways to understand stuff like corruption, which is super hard to measure.
Right. It's like, hey, we can't measure corruption directly, so let's get creative. I mean, who knew politicians' bodies could be a clue?
Seriously. It reminds us that sometimes looking at things from a totally different angle can lead to the most interesting discoveries.
Makes you wonder about how we see power and leadership. Could there be some hidden bias in our brains that connects, like, a bigger body size with authority?
It's possible. Think about all those classic images of powerful leaders throughout history, kings and emperors, and even some presidents, not exactly known for being, super skinny.
Yeah, more like six-pack at banquets, right? Have you ever seen a skinny Roman emperor statue? Those guys love their feasts.
Exactly. And while we might think we've moved past those old stereotypes, it's worth asking if maybe some of those biases are still hanging around in our heads somewhere.
And how could those biases affect how we see corruption? Like, what if a politician doesn't fit that image of powerful? Are we less likely to trust them?
That's a great question. It makes you think about how much weight we put, no pun intended, on how politicians look. Should it even matter when we're trying to judge their ability to lead?
It's a tough one. Obviously, we don't want to be shallow and judge a book by its cover. But this study is hinting that maybe there is a connection between a leader's health and how healthy their nation is, at least in terms of how people see corruption.
It is tricky. We shouldn't jump to conclusions based just on looks. But this study definitely throws a wrench in things, suggesting there might be more going on beneath the surface.
And then there's that whole silver lining thing we talked about, the idea that corruption might actually lead to a thinner population in some cases.
Oh, yeah, that one really makes you scratch your head. Is it possible that a little bit of corruption in some twisted way could be good for people's waistlines? That just sounds crazy.
Totally backwards. But remember what the researcher said. In those countries with a lot of corruption, the resources tend to get piled up at the top, leaving less for everyone else.
So basically, less food to go around means slimmer citizens, even if it's because of corrupt practices. That's kind of a depressing thought.
It's not a happy picture, that's for sure. But it just shows how complex and unpredictable things get when you mix politics, power, and everyone's weight together. This study really flips our assumptions about how these things work.
It definitely throws a wrench in things. It really highlights why fighting corruption is important, not just because it's wrong, but because it can have real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about how they did this study, the potential biases it uncovers, and just how complicated things are when you mix health and politics. But this whole study was focused on former Soviet countries.
Right, which makes you wonder, does this whole BMI corruption link only exist in that part of the world? Or could it be something we see everywhere?
Right. Is it just a weird post-Soviet thing, or could it be more universal?
Now that's where things get really interesting. Researchers are working on figuring that out, and the possibilities are pretty mind-blowing.
Because if this trend holds up in other places, it could totally change how we think about power, body image, and corruption on a global scale. It'd be like cracking a secret code that unlocks a whole new level of understanding.
Think about it. All those different cultures, political systems, and economies around the world. If this BMI corruption connection is the same across all those wildly different places.
It would suggest that there's something deeper going on in human behavior, something that goes beyond national borders and political beliefs.
It could point to a fundamental link between how we view power, how we see our own bodies, and how much corruption we're willing to tolerate.
Whoa, okay, my brain is officially fried. This is some deep stuff.
It is deep, and it reminds us that even the simplest observations, like noticing a pattern in how heavy politicians are, can lead to really profound questions about ourselves and the world. It's like those optical illusions where you see one thing and then suddenly, boom, it shifts and you see something totally different.
You know what? I think we've officially reached peak deep dive here. We started with this study about politicians' BMI and corruption, and now we're spiraling into this crazy exploration of power, health, and what it means to be human.
It's been quite a journey, and while we may not have all the answers, we've uncovered some seriously thought-provoking questions along the way, questions that I hope will stick with our listeners long after this episode is over.
Absolutely. Before we wrap things up, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with? What's the one big takeaway you hope they walk away with today?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. Don't underestimate the power of observation. Sometimes the most unexpected clues can lead to the most profound insights. And who knows, maybe the next time you see a picture of a politician, you'll see them in a whole new light.
All right, deep divers, we've been on this crazy train ride connecting politicians' BMI and corruption and how it might reflect what's going on in society. But now let's bring it back to you guys, the listeners. What does this all mean for how you see the world?
That's a great point. I mean, what's the use of knowledge if we can't actually use it in our own lives, right? So how can we take all this stuff from the study and apply it to, everyday life?
Exactly. We don't want this to just be some crazy facts that you forget about 5 minutes after the episode's over. We want you to actually walk away with some real takeaways. So how can we make this research, relevant?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway here is to be really critical of the stuff we're seeing and hearing all the time, especially when it comes to politics. It's easy to get caught up in how politicians look, what they say in sound bites, and those perfectly staged photos.
Oh, totally. It's like we're constantly swiping through politicians on Tinder or something, judging them based on a couple of pics and a catchy slogan.
Exactly. But this study's like a big wake-up call. It's saying, hey, look beyond the surface. Don't just swipe right on the politician with the best smile or the most flattering photo.
Do your research. Don't fall into that trap of thinking that a skinny politician automatically means a country with no corruption.
Right. Remember those Baltic states? Slim ministers, but maybe not the squeaky cleanest record when it comes to corruption.
Exactly. So instead of judging politicians just by their waistlines, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What are the systems, the policies, the power dynamics that are really at play here? What's really contributing to corruption?
Because let's be real, corruption is rarely just a few bad apples. It's often built into how the whole system works.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by just wiping up the water.
Yeah.
You got to get in there and tighten those pipes. So next time you're checking out a political candidate, don't just focus on their looks or how charismatic they are.
Do your homework. Look at their past, what they've actually done, what policies they support, and how committed they are to being transparent and accountable.
Read past those attention-grabbing headlines and really dig into their actions. Are they actually doing what they say they're going to do?
Exactly. Look for substance over style. And think about the context they're working in. What pressures are they facing? What's influencing their choices?
Because understanding those pressures can help us make better choices about who we support and how we participate in politics. We become more than just, passive bystanders. We become active participants who can actually make a difference.
And remember, change starts with awareness. By recognizing our own biases and questioning the stories we're being told, we become more informed and engaged citizens.
And that, my friends, is what the deep dive is all about. Taking a deep dive into these complex issues, challenging our assumptions, and giving you the knowledge to navigate this crazy world.
So next time you see a headline about corruption or even just a photo of a politician, don't just keep scrolling. Take a second to think about what we've talked about today.
Use those critical thinking skills. Ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and never stop exploring the world around you, even the parts that are kind of weird or unsettling.
Because the more we understand, the more we can actually do something about it.
That's it for this deep dive, deep divers. Thanks for joining us on this journey exploring power, politics, and those hidden clues that are all around us. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep on diving deep.